I'd like you to listen carefully to this one tonight because what we're about to talk about, it's not a version of history that you're normally given. However, at the moment, we're just constantly being bombarded with this white guilt and this need for reparations to be paid by us, people that have never owned slaves, to another group, people that have never been slaves. But let's start with this one. Slavery, it's not a uniquely British crime. It's not even a Western invention. And it's certainly not confined to one race, one nation, or even one moment in time. It is, in truth, one of humanity's oldest and darkest habits. Long before Britain ever even ruled an empire, slavery existed. In the ancient worlds of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece and Rome, human beings were bought, sold and owned. In Asia, across China and India, systems of forced labour and bondage were deeply embedded into society for generations. Even in the Americas, before the Europeans arrived there for the first time, slavery already existed amongst the indigenous civilizations. In Africa, long before, again, the Europeans arrived, slavery was not only present, but part of the established system. Captives were taken through war, through raids, or even as punishment, and were traded and owned by the African kingdoms themselves. And then at the same time, across the Arab world, the Ottoman Empire, all of these different locations around the globe, vast slave networks operated for thousands of years. Millions of Africans, many Europeans were taken through this trans-Saharan route across the Red Sea and through into the Indian Ocean area. And this isn't just my opinion, this is historical fact. So when we talk about slavery, we're not talking about one guilty nation. We're talking about a systemic failure on a global level of humanity, of us all. Now, let's also be clear of another thing. And I'm not trying to excuse the transatlantic slave trade in any way. It was horrific. It was brutal. And it was also deeply racial in its nature. But it wasn't created by Britain. It began earlier, with the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch and the French. And over time, around 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic by multiple European powers. Britain did become a major player later, probably transporting around 3.1 million people. And, none of us are going to deny that this was an incredibly dark chapter for our country. No honest person can deny that. But here's the part that's often left out. Britain didn't just participate in slavery, it actually led the fight to end it. In 1807, the Slave Trade Act made it illegal for British ships to carry slaves, not just within the empire, but anywhere. And then, in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act freed around 800,000 enslaved people across the British colonies. But we, the British, that we're all part of, didn't stop there. The Royal Navy patrolled the West African coast for decades, intercepting the slave trips, freeing captives, and actively suppressing the trade worldwide. Just think about that. The same empire that once profited from slavery became the first major power to turn against it and enforce its abolition globally. Why? Because something changed. There was a moral shift, and it was driven by faith, by conscience, by voices like William Wilberforce, who refused to accept that slavery was a normal practice any longer. And that matters, because progress doesn't come from pretending evil never existed. It comes from recognising it and choosing to end it. And then this is where some people try and blur these lines, because they compare currently slavery to the harsh conditions of the factory workers, across the Industrial Revolution. And yes, whilst those conditions were brutal, with the long hours, the child labour and the dangerous environments, these were not slaves in the truest sense. Factory workers were not property. They could not be bought or sold. The children were not born into ownership. We have to accept that slavery wasn't just hardship, like in the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, it was total dehumanization. And that distinction matters. And it still matters today because slavery has not disappeared. And we talked about this the other week. Right now in the modern world, an estimated 50 million people are living in conditions of slavery. And that's forced labour, human trafficking, forced marriage. This is not history anymore we're talking about. This is current events happening right now across the globe. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a choice. We can continue pointing fingers at one nation, one race, one moment in time, or we can face the actual truth. Slavery was never just British. It was never just European. It was never just white against black. It was human beings exploiting other human beings across continents, across the centuries. And it's a shared darkness in our collective history, but also a shared capacity to change. Because the same story, the same timeline that includes slavery also includes abolition. So the same humanity capable of absolute cruelty is also capable of absolute consciousness. And if we're serious about justice and not just the narratives, then we need to focus not just on dividing from the past, but on ending slavery that is happening today across the world. Completely, for everyone. So rather than saying that we have to give reparations to this group, why don't we say, actually, we collectively are going to ensure that no one can ever be enslaved again?